Welcome to this webinar on designing for accessibility and some key considerations. We're going to be covering the following WCAG2 success criteria. They relate to sensory characteristics, the use of colour, the contrast of colour, the ability to resize text, and the importance of having consistent navigation and identification of components. So first off, looking at success criteria 1.3.3, sensory characteristics. This is described as instructions provided for understanding and operating content do not rely solely on sensory characteristics of components such as shape, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. So what does this mean? This means that because not all users will be able to perceive these sensory characteristics, we should not rely on a particular characteristic to identify functionality or content. So blind users will have difficulty understanding instructions referencing a shape, for instance. Deaf users similarly will not be able to follow audible alerts such as a beep to indicate something has happened. And by catering for multiple senses, you can just maximize how many people will be able to understand any instructions you're providing. So here I've got an example on the right hand side. It's actually just a snippet from a instruction set I found on the Eon website. Now if I Alt Tab to this now, I can find on this page here, so this is an FAQs page, and typically when I'm looking for examples of sensory characteristics, I would look on pages that feature instructions, pages that feature sets instructions on telling people what to do or to do a certain activity, because it's in that interaction, in that dialogue where you expect to find some reference. Click here to do this, go here and do that. And in those sorts of instructions, you're likely to find some reference to a sensory characteristic. Now, I've actually been through this page in depth and I found one example here. So if let me just zoom in so I can hopefully show you this a bit more easily. If I click on, when I try and view the bill page, the page is blank, what should I do? And expand this. This contains instructions on how to download a PDF bill from the website, from your account, and then it gives some instructions on how to open it within the default application for PDFs. And I just want to highlight this line here. If there is no application listed, you may need to click the triangle to the left of Open With so that it points downwards to reveal the current setting. Now, to a sighted user interacting with the operating system and the application for PDFs, that may well make sense. But for a screen reader user, they might not be described, or they might not be told rather, that something is a triangle, whether it's pointing down or pointing up. So in those cases, it may be better to look at a slightly different description of that task for somebody. Now, I haven't been through and tried that task out myself, but what it would need doing is to try out with a screen reader and actually find out what those controls are labeled as, and then describe that in the instructions. So there's no need to have separate instructions for screen readers. You can combine it into the same set of instructions, but it would need to be described separately so that those instructions made sense to a screen reader user. Now, some other examples which might be easier to understand and more likely to find, you may find references to press the square button to continue in a form. You may be relying on the size of content, so in a large listing of energy deals, you may use a slightly larger font to indicate the best deal for a particular user. If a user cannot perceive visually the page, then they will not be able to perceive which is the largest text size, and so that will not make sense to them. Another common example I find is if you're asking users to select from a list of options, the instructions might say, select from the options on the right-hand side. And lesser known now, but still found fairly often, is an audio alert. So where a beep might indicate that an error has occurred, or that an application has been submitted, or something similar, your meter reading's ready. That is something that will only be accessible to people who have hearing. So people who are deaf will not be able to take advantage of and understand that type of audible alert unless it's accompanied by a corresponding visual alert. So what are the requirements to satisfy this checkpoint? Providing alternative methods of alerts. So if you do provide an audio alert, you should flash up a message visually as well, and that caters for users who cannot hear the audio alert. They will see the visual alert. if you do need to reference something visually, instead of saying click the list of options to the right, instead reference the heading directly above those options. So select from the list of options below the available tariffs heading would be better for people, because then a screen reader user who cannot see the screen and doesn't have the same concept of left or right as a sighted user, they will still be able to find that content by searching for the heading on a page. And if you do reference something visually, instead of saying press the square button, say press the submit button. You're describing the text on the button, which can be read by all users if they're using a screen reader, if they're hearing impaired, and so on, instead of describing it by shape, which will be less easy for people who cannot see the page or perceive the page visually. Now, this is a very common one. Then moving on to the next success criteria, use of color. And this stands alone from the sensory characteristics because it's so important and so common that in a similar way, it says that you should not rely on users being able to perceive color. So the description of the success criteria is that color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. So really that boils down to the fact that not all users can perceive pages visually, which includes color. So you should not rely on color being perceived to indicate any action. So indicate what is a link, the selected status of something, and another common one is charts. So if we have a look at some examples, here is a very good use of color. Now, so in this case, this is a chart I found on the Eon Energy website, and it's very easy to tell at a glance the value of each of those bar charts, even without the use of color. The color just makes it easier to distinguish them, but in actual fact, they're all above a very sensible text label anyway, 2008, 2009, 2010, and so on. So the use of color is augmenting the existing data on a graph. It's helping users, but it's not the only means. So if I removed all the color from that chart and made it into a grayscale chart, I would still be able to get a value for each year. So that is an example of a good use of color. Now here is an example of a bad use of color. I grabbed this from the Citizens Advice Bureau website earlier on, and this chart here just shows the number of complaints about different companies, and it uses a line chart to do so. So it shows them over time, the 4 quarters throughout a year, and the number of complaints that each company has received. Now, on the left-hand side, we've got an example that uses color, and it has a key telling users what those colors mean. So it's easy for a sighted user who can perceive color to distinguish those different lines on that line chart. If, however, we run a filter and display that same graph as grayscale as we have done on the right-hand side, all of a sudden that information is lost. It is no longer possible to effectively distinguish those different lines, and therefore users will not be able to get the information they need from that chart. And that's because the chart is relying solely on color. So users who do not perceive color are missing out on that information. Now, how can you test for use of color? So very common examples are links that are not underlined. So if we have a look at the actual Eon website here, now all links here are both red and they're underlined. However, on other websites, you might find that links are just highlighted using a slightly different color, but they're not underlined. And that means if as soon as you remove the color information from the page, users cannot find links. It's great that they're all underlined on the Eon website, and that's something that I would strongly advocate for any website, that all links are underlined. It's what users expect. And given the importance of links in browsing websites, it's critical that they're easy to find and navigate with. So that's a good example from across the Eon website. Another fairly common example is charts and graphs. Colors are widely used in charts and graphs. The good example we found on the Eon Energy website made positive use of color, i.e. it wasn't the only means for users to extract information. But it's always something to bear in mind if you are producing any sort of chart. Do not avoid using color. By all means, use color in your chart, but make sure that if it's used to convey or highlight some information, that information is also highlighted in a way that doesn't use color. And the third option, which I see fairly often, is color to identify errors with form fields. So when you submit a form with either incorrect or missing data, often the erroneous fields are highlighted in red and only red. Now, if a user cannot perceive red, that's not going to be very helpful. So you need to have a text description of the error message displayed next to each form field as well, saying something like, please complete this form field, or this form field contains invalid characters. So that's just a way around that issue. How can you address use of colour issues? Well, as I've already said, you can use underlines in links, and that's just good practice. However, where you're using charts, you might have a line chart, you can use different shapes to break up the lines. So you can have a dotted line for one line chart, you can have a dashed line for another, a combination of dots and dashes, or even squares or triangles. And that means that you are no longer relying on colour. So use colour as well, but also use a different non-colour based technique for distinguishing information in charts. And also, as you've done here in the right hand side, so this is another example from the Eon Energy website, there a pie chart has been used to give a breakdown of energy use in agriculture. And the pie chart is a very useful visual medium for conveying information. It gives a good proportional view of how the breakdown of usage is, but it also has a text key to the left hand side, which contains a little line pointing at the different areas of that chart, and that means that users who cannot perceive colour can still trace those lines along and be able to extract the information they need. So in fact, they can just read the text straight from that label and know that their 6% energy use goes towards lighting in agriculture, even without needing to look at the chart. So that's a really useful way of doing things. Okay, related to colour is contrast. So this is described as the visual presentation of text and images of text has a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, except for the following. And then it goes on to give a few examples, which I haven't listed here, but the other examples include things like logo types. So logos for brands do not have a contrast ratio allowance. And there is slightly different ratio of contrast for large text, that is text that's above 18 point size, has a reduced set of contrast ratio requirements. For this episode, we're just going to be focusing on standard size text, which has a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. So why is color contrast important? For one thing, users may have low vision. They might need very high contrast text in order to read it and distinguish it on the screen. Nowadays, more than ever, people might be using your website on a mobile device. They might be using it outside in very bright conditions, and all of a sudden it's more difficult to see the screen. They therefore also benefit from having higher contrast text. And people of older computers have monitors that will be less optimal than modern monitors. They'll be displaying things a lot dimmer, colors won't be as pronounced, and so on. So these users will also benefit from high contrast just to make things readable at a minimum. Now, how can you test for contrast related issues? The best way of planning against these is at the design stage, creating a color palette and testing it there. And that way, anytime somebody uses colors from that color palette, they've already been checked and you know that they meet the contrast requirements. Now you can check it live. There are various tools. There are one or two automated tools that do try and check color contrast issues, but by and large, color contrast checking is going to be a manual type check because the way pages are put together, you can never be 100% sure what the difference is between two colors, if they're displayed on a color background or an image background or so on. So it's very difficult to do that automatically. Now, let's have a look at a live example. So one useful tool that can be made use of is something called the Color Contrast Analyzer. Now, this has a very useful feature. You can actually just point and click. So you can have this little eyedropper tool and select the foreground color. Let's select the text color here. Okay, and then you can use a color picker and select the background color. And that will just grab those two colors. So here we've got the foreground color and the background color on the right. And then it will give us an instant feedback of how those colors have behaved. So in this case, it's actually found a problem with that red as used for the link text. It has a contrast ratio of 3.9 to 1, but it should actually have a ratio of 4.5 to 1 or higher. So that's a very quick tool. After a while, you get used to looking at pages and spotting what is likely to cause a problem from a contrast perspective, and then you can easily fire up this tool and double check those colors. Another useful tool that goes alongside this I want to show you is called the Contrast Finder, the Tanaguru Contrast Finder. Now, this is a web page and it doesn't have a color picker, but what you can do, I find very useful, is to use the color contrast analyzer, use that to pick the colors and then copy them from there and then paste them into the Tanaguru Contrast Finder. And what that will do is it will also analyze those colors for you. So you choose the foreground color and the background color, the ratio you want to reach, and then you can say whether you want it to edit the foreground color or the background color. And if I say, let's edit the foreground color now because we want a plain white background, let's check and find the contrast. And what that will do, that will check the contrast and it will tell you, okay, for the red and white we've picked, the contrast ratio is 3.9 to 1, which fails. But then what it does do is it produces a range of other combinations using that same background color and amending the foreground color that do reach the required minimum contrast requirements. So in this case, it's found a slightly more pastel terracotta red, which actually has a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, which is just over the minimum, compared to 3.9 to 1. So it's a good improvement there. Further down, we've got another red, which is even more similar to the one we had to start with. And that also meets the required minimum contrast ratio. So there's a few methods then. You will find other online calculators that allow you to test color contrast very easily. But those are two methods right there. And I really do find using the Tanaguru Contrast Finder very useful in finding an accessible alternative. Just one thing I wanted to highlight is that where you have text over images, as here on the right hand side, it's always good to double check those, because whilst over most of the image the text might have good contrast, over the yellow bar there the text has very poor contrast. And in those cases, as with captions, I'd suggest having a black block background behind the text. So there would be a black mask behind the text that obscures the image behind, and that just gives a solid, consistent color for the text to have as a background color and just makes the contrast that much more consistent across the image. So just something to be aware of. There aren't many examples of this on the Eon Energy website, but where they do occur, they can cause problems like this. Okay, moving on to the next success criteria, the ability to resize text. And this is described as, except for captions and images of text, text can be resized without assistive technology up to 200% without loss of content or functionality. So why is it important? Well, low vision users may wish to increase the default text size to make content easier to read. And elderly users, who often don't consider themselves to be disabled, may still get some benefit from actually being able to enlarge the text, whether that's pinch zoom on a mobile or just using control on their keyboard and the mouse wheel to zoom in. They're both ways equally useful of making text larger. Now, on the Eon Energy website, there is a problem with the text size in as much as it cannot be resized independently of the rest of the site. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go to the website and have a look. So we will go to the home page, go to the business home page in fact, and what I want to do is just go to the view menu in Internet Explorer, go to text size and go to largest. And whilst the navigation resizes at the top of the page, you will find that all of the content down here does not. So if I now jump the text size down to a smaller size, you'll see that this body text has no difference. Even though the main navigation has gone very small, the body text remains exactly the same size. So that is one problem with the Eon Energy website to a text size. Now another example is that whilst you can actually use the control and mouse wheel to zoom in, as we see here, as I zoom in, everything gets larger in this case. So actually it enlarges everything, which is great. But what it does, if you look down the bottom of the screen, it's now giving me a scroll bar. And I'm having to scroll both vertically and horizontally to navigate around the page. And that is going to be very difficult for users, especially a screen magnifier user who might already have additional scroll bars. Having to zoom in and then scroll left and right and up and down adds a dimension of difficulty. So it's best to allow users to resize the text independently. Failing that, having a site that works very well in a responsive fashion, so when you zoom in, there is still no horizontal scrolling. The site just adapts to fit a longer page, meaning users have to scroll down further, but they don't have to scroll left and right as well, which is far easier for all users. So that's why it's important to allow text to resize. Now, how can you check this? Well, we just looked in Internet Explorer. You can either use the view and text size menu and jump from largest to smallest and have a visual check to see if any content, any text on the page does resize. If it does, that's great. Make sure that it resizes such that it's still readable, it's not being obscured by images or other content. Another alternative is to actually try using the browser zoom. So hold down the control key on your keyboard and then do the mouse wheel up or down. And that will actually zoom in and zoom out proportionally, and that zooms in the whole page as we've just done there. The issue is that you may find the site may remain usable, but there may be a horizontal scroll bar, which is going to be less than ideal. So by all means, try both methods out. The first one is preferable because users just resize the text. They don't need to worry about resizing the whole page. Just making the text on its own bigger can be very useful. How can you fix text resizing issues? Well, you need to set the text size using one of these measurements, either ems, percentages, or rems. And by setting the text size for the whole document using one of those units, you allow browsers to resize that font in respect to users' action. So user can select larger text from the menu or zoom in, and this will allow those texts to resize appropriately. Okay, moving on to 3.2.3, consistent navigation. This concerns repeated navigation blocks, and it's described as navigational mechanisms that are repeated on multiple web pages within a set of web pages, occur in the same relative order each time they are repeated, unless a change is initiated by the user. So why is this important? Well, when moving between pages on a site, it's important that users have a feel of consistency. They should always be able to find controls very easily that help them navigate through the site, that get to a previous page, continue on to another page, and so on. Now, an interesting case on the Eon website, if we have a look at this, so let me just zoom back out. I am on the business section. If I now jump into the home section, and I'll just toggle between these. So let me zoom in a bit. You may notice that the order of the top navigation changes there. So on the home section, it's announced as get started, ways to save and help. And on the business section, it starts off with our products, energy efficiency, and account and help. So that's two slightly different interpretations of those top level navigation bars. Now, this is not necessarily a problem. As long as those navigation bars are consistent within those sections, so within the business section or within the home section, and within those sections the navigation menus are consistent and displayed in that same order, that would be sufficient for this checkpoint. It's really useful because it gives users some reassurance that they're still on the same website as they switch from page to page, providing they interact with the navigation in the same way. That helps just reassure them that they are on the correct website. And it reassures them because they know the navigation mechanism, they know how they can get back to where they just came from and how they can proceed onto another page. So how can you check for it? Well, it's a purely visual check. It's very difficult to check this automatically. And what you'll need to do is manually review pages from a few different sections of the site, and then just look out for repeated navigation blocks along the top of the page. That's where they most often appear. You might also check the footer navigation, and then just check those that the items appear in the same order across each of those pages. The same link should appear in the navigation bar, and they should appear in the same order within the navigation bar so it can be predictable by users. So here's just the examples from the Eon Energy home and business sections. We can see those menus are slightly different, but they are consistent within each menu, within each section. So when you go into the business section, that top navigation bar has a consistent appearance throughout that section, and that's really what we're looking for. The best way to address issues relating to consistent navigation is having reusable components. So a component, just a stripped down bit of HTML that you can basically drag and drop into an environment, will mean that the navigation bars are done in a consistent way because they're all coming from the same source. If you do have a CMS driven website, this will likely not be a problem for you anyway, because they will use a template-based approach as we've just described there. So that will actually address some of the issues that relate to consistent navigation issues. Okay, moving on to 3.2.4, consistent identification. This is very similar to consistent navigation. It's described as components that have the same functionality within a set of web pages are identified consistently. So this just really relates to how they are described, particularly to screen reader users, how contents are labeled up, how they are described to users. So similarly to consistent navigation, ensuring that you have consistently identified functionality is reassuring for users because it just reminds them of the site they're on, and if they progress from page to page, they begin to feel more confident that they can easily interact with the page they're on by just going through the navigation, which they know because it's the same as every other page. And it does make users more easily able to find content once they have learned how it is identified. So that might be a search button, that might be a show main menu pop-up button on mobiles, and so on. Now, how can you test for this issue? The best way is really to use a screen reader to navigate through the page. This will vocalize how controls are identified and labeled for you. An alternative is to use the web accessibility toolbar, which can highlight each of the controls on a page and just display its text label above it. So if we just go in here now, and I then turn images on, we can see that the login and search here at the top right, they're both labeled with login and search on every page. The Eon homepage there, that's a logo link back to the Eon homepage. So again, that's a fairly descriptive title, and those navigation items are appearing to be consistently identified. So all we're really looking at is the label for graphical components such as a magnifying icon, a logo, links such as the login and search, and if they are identified consistently, that is going to be a sort of pass for this checkpoint. So how can you ensure that functionality is consistently identified? A really good way of doing this is to have a style guide, and that means that people adding content later on can use the same techniques as you may have used in the past to identify content, so by providing a description of how content should be labeled and then giving examples. If you are using navigation controls across multiple pages, as with the navigation checkpoint we've just looked at, having a shared component, so a centralized store of patterns or components such as navigation menus, so they're repeated on every page, is another way of ensuring that these items are labeled in a consistent way. Okay, that's a run through the key considerations for design related to web development. Do hope that's been useful. If you do have any questions or feedback, please do contact your line manager who will pass any questions on to us. Thank you.